Welcome everybody. Thanks for joining. We're going to get started in about 2 minutes while we wait for a couple of attendees to filter in. But happy Wednesday. Welcome to today's webinar, and we're really excited to kick this off. But we kick this off in just a couple of minutes.
So Kevin, where are you today, or where are you located?
I'm located over in New York City. Yourself?
Oh, nice. I'm in Poland right now, visiting part of my team. We'll talk about that later. But yeah, it's later in the day here, so
It looks a little dark outside. I was going to mention that.
Yeah, the weather's been beautiful. So, but it's great to talk to you today.
Yeah, for sure. Are you in office somewhere, or?
Yeah, I'm in. We have an office right in the center of Warsaw, which is the capital city of Poland. So, great education systems here, lots of great developers, and it's a booming high tech business. So we have a fantastic team here. So
yeah, how often are you traveling back and forth between?
I try to get here about once a quarter.
Yeah.
It's almost half my team, so I try to stay in touch with them as close as possible. And they have a lot of good food here too, so it's a good reason to visit.
Did you have a global engineering team pre-pandemic? Has there been more hiring post-pandemic?
Yeah, I've had global engineering teams for decades at this point, different companies. But for Applause, we've had a global engineering team since before I started.
Yeah, you were doing it before it was cool. Awesome. Well, I think we gave it a couple of minutes just for people to join the webinar. So, why don't we get started, and I'll kick things off. So, hey everybody, we're really excited that you've joined for our webinar today. I'm super excited to host this topic. As software development gets faster and moves at a greater scale, we keep seeing this as a super important topic for organizations to build process around the open source and third-party code that developers are using, but really mold the approach to compliance and security all around the developer workflow. And so I'm super excited today because Applause has implemented this beautifully at scale in the real world and has a lot of really great practical pieces of advice and best practices from doing so. And so, I'm excited to host this webinar on how Applause makes open source license compliance and security as easy as possible for its engineering team. And joining me today is Rob Mason, the CTO of Applause. And, my name is Kevin Wang. I'm the CEO here at FOSSA, and I'll be your host for today's discussion. Rob, thanks for joining.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so before I go over our agenda and introduce Rob, I'd like to cover a couple of housekeeping points. First, we will try to answer any audience questions as they're submitted. So feel free to, post them into the chat or post them into the question box. If we can't get to them, we'll also have time at the very end for Q&A. So please post any questions, and we will try to keep this as interactive as possible. Next, this webinar is being recorded and will be sent after the event. So if you are worried you're going to miss anything or the discussion moves a little bit too quickly, you'll have a copy of this afterwards. And then finally, we at FOSSA will be following up with all of you after the webinar is finished with a few additional resources to see if there's anything we can do to help your organization with open source management. So with that out of the way, let's get started, and let's first take a look at our agenda. And so after a couple quick introductions, we'll touch on Applause's engineering organization, kind of key engineering principles that they've developed to help drive their open source management process. Then we'll dive into how Applause uses and manages open source and third-party software with a focus on how it's enabled its engineering team to keep sprinting while staying safe. And then finally, we'll focus on a couple of best practices they've implemented and close out with a look at how Applause has integrated FOSSA and the whole value of automation and making developer-friendly open source management possible. Great. So before I introduce Rob, just a quick word for folks who are not familiar with FOSSA. FOSSA helps companies manage the open source and third-party code that developers use. Our primary use cases are focused on driving compliance with open source and third-party licenses, and also helping companies defend against open source and third-party vulnerabilities that the developers maybe bring in when using third-party software. And a big focus of our product is to do this all real-time within the developer workflow at scale. And so, with those out of the way, I just want to introduce Rob. So our speaker for today's webinar, Robert Mason, is the CTO of Applause. Rob is a really experienced engineering leader who's built great teams at several leading companies. and he's seen a variety of scale across the engineering teams he's built globally. Now he leads technology at an industry leader in application testing. Applause. With that, Rob, I'm wondering if you could share a bit more about yourself, your background, and how you got here at this stage in your career.
Sure. Yeah, I've been developing for a very long time. I won't disclose how many decades that includes, but so I'm a developer. I'm still hands-on. I still do development to whenever I can, but generally not in the main product path anymore. But so I understand the developer life cycle, the challenges they face, and all their needs. But I also have been exposed more and more over time to the needs of the business from a legal and compliance perspective. And so, I see myself as sitting between those worlds and trying to protect my developers so they can focus on the work and get things done and be fast and agile, and but also help the business protect its assets and its interests and those of our customers. So so it's a passion for me to make everyone and all processes and systems as efficient as possible. And I'm excited to talk to you about FOSSA because you guys have helped us do some of that. So it's been very beneficial for the team.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, and so when I'm not doing high tech, I live on a horse farm in Massachusetts in the U.S. and I do low tech things to decompress.
That's awesome. How many horses do you have?
11 right now.
Wow. I wonder what's the greater responsibility, the engineering teams or the horses?
It's a bit like herding a bit of both.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
Yeah, great. Well, Rob, before we get into the details of how you built your whole open source management program, I think this discussion can be really interesting today because in many ways your engineering team serves other development teams around the world, and it could be a really great blueprint on how the things should be done by just the nature of what you do. And so I guess, can you tell me a bit more about Applause, what Applause does, and just how you've built your engineering team to support it?
Yeah, happy to do that. So this isn't a sales pitch, of course, but Applause is the world leader in testing and digital quality. So we partner with a lot of the world's largest brands to ensure that their digital assets and experiences are the highest quality and work as intended. And the way we do that is we have the world's largest global community of crowdsourced testers and digital quality experts. So that if you look at, again, I've been an engineer for a very long time. In the early days, QA was an afterthought, and then eventually it became inside teams where you had dedicated QA testers and QA labs. Companies outgrew those static environments and teams. It was hard to staff them, hard to keep up with the costs. Eventually, we moved to a lot of offshore models where we outsourced in India and other locations. But again, those were geographically co-located lab-like environments. And at the same time, these digital experiences became more and more complex. They became what we call omni-channel, or crossing from your web browser to your mobile phone to physical experiences. And the differences in devices changed a lot over time. So it became much more important for the largest brands in the world to need real world testing with real people in real countries and real devices and all the different permutations. So the next generation of QA has been here for a while. Applause is 14 years old at this point. We have a crowd that spans over 200 countries and is extremely large, or the largest one in the world by a long shot. And with them, they bring lots of devices in the real world for testing. So it's not a lab environment. It's real people in the real world testing things. And we provide solutions like functional testing, accessibility testing, localization. We even do data collection and validation for products that have machine learning in them. So a big range of things. So we are advisors and helpers as people are developing product, and then in the final stages before they ship. And a lot of times we're seeing the next great applications, websites, IoT devices, smart cars, all those things before they hit the market. So it's exciting because we see what's coming and we see the market, and we get to help some fantastic brands achieve success. And so with that, we have a lot of experience and exposure to development processes across all these customers, which is interesting. And so sometimes our conversations are not just about how we help them on creating great quality and great experiences, but it's comparing notes of our challenges with software development and their challenges, and that's very interesting. It's great to be at the center of all that, and I'm sure FOSSA gets to see a lot of the same things as you guys are also, real developers developing real applications, as I know, and have the same challenges. So it's great. It's nice to be a developer and talk to other development teams, but also help them in different ways. And in that way, FOSSA and Applause are similar in some regards there.
Yeah, I think, I see so many parallels. I think maybe in the universe of application testing, like there's a ton of surface area that has now popped up that's driven a lot of demand for these kinds of use cases. And I think there's similar surface area popping up around our own software development practices in every company. More tools, more languages, more complex software supply chains, or just inventories of third-party software that we're using. I'd love to maybe spend some time talking about some of Applause's engineering principles, and maybe here's what we've seen across our customers when we observe, the common patterns around development processes. But we see maybe two shared trends across the majority of our customers that are changing the ways that tools, processes, and policies are built. The two big ones that come to mind for me are like this attitude of continually releasing, continually testing. And so, we're seeing these like discrete points where you'd have a release and you have a lot of review around it start to melt away. And a lot of teams move to these like continually updated digital experiences. Some teams are shipping multiple times a week. Some teams are doing it multiple times a day, at greater scale, maybe multiple times an hour. And because of that, there's this like attitude of continual testing, continual validation driven by automation. Tools and processes kind of have to scale to this real-time release cadence. And then with that, also just like a cultural shift towards like developer empowerment, less top-down process, more, giving developers choice in their languages and tools, an attitude of freedom. And, that leads to also like fragmentation in tools and processes that organizations need to adapt around, but a real kind of choice of allowing developers to use the tools that they see fit and move as quickly as possible. Have you seen similar things at Applause at your customers? Has that molded your approach in any way to running the team?
Yeah. Wow, so that's a big question. So yes, we see an acceleration of release cycles, and even larger enterprises, people in industries where you would think they are maybe slow and old, they're having to keep up. If you just look at like the banking industry, they were old and slow for a very long time, but they have lots of competitors coming. Even if you look at T-Mobile now, they have their own bank and checking account and stuff like that. So everyone's getting into the banking industry, anywhere from cryptocurrency to other techniques, and so or other approaches, and they're threatening the old industry. So they have to modernize, they have to move faster, they have to deliver better experiences, and the old websites and mobile apps that you used to get from your banks are no longer acceptable. People will switch, and that's the challenge. Is the market now will switch easily and quickly, and they won't have the patience with you. So you have to keep up, you have to release faster, and so you need to find things to accelerate your release cycle. That's automation around compliance checking, obviously, as you guys are very familiar. It's more automation around QA, as much as you can do. And then you can't automate everything. So it's a fast and agile QA team that can work around the clock in different geographies and things like that. So it's a number of different approaches to help you accelerate in that area. And then if you look, just unpacking that question, if you look at the developer choices, there's a shortage of developers in the industry. We've been fighting over them for years. We need more because there's more and more digital experiences, more things being developed, and they need more freedom and agility to move fast. So you're seeing companies embracing microservices, where you have dozens, and this is the case for Applause too. We have a microservices architecture. We have dozens of microservices in many different languages. We have some biases towards some languages, but we also have microservices in other languages that, based on the skill sets at the time and the fit of the language and the various portions of the stack to the business problem we're trying to solve. But that allows you for a lot more flexibility around recruiting and hiring and training and ramping and all that sort of stuff. And so microservices give developers more freedom. It gives you a very contained stack, and if you want to check the quality of what's in a microservice, you can do that start to finish. And so there's a lot of lot of great things that come out of microservices, and we're seeing more and more customers embrace microservices over time.
Yeah, totally. You made a comment around how some of these traditional industries are changing their approach to software development, banking being an example. I've been really surprised over the past couple of years because there are these, verticals or sectors that are kind of mimetic for being slower moving or more risk oriented, like banking, government, and the Fed. But I would say over the past couple of years, it's changed a lot. A lot of these sectors are completely embracing modern development practices. Some are kind of leapfrogging others, and the sort of ethos of using open source, moving really quickly, automating as much as possible, aggressively adopting cloud native infrastructure and cloud native best practices is as I felt like really come to full force. I guess, on this slide, we have a bunch of content around how, POS has designed a couple parts of its engineering principles. Are there any key ones you think are worth, sharing or highlighting or?
So one thing that I'm very passionate about inside this company and in prior companies is maintenance of your platform. So Applause is a 14-year-old company. We've been developing software for that long, and there's old portions of the system. They need to be updated. They can't be left alone. Software development doesn't stop the minute you ship. It continues and it keeps going. And if you take eyes off of it, it doesn't age well. And you guys are often about detecting how well or how poorly things are aging in the system. And it's important to have eyes on that. And it's without automation, it's hard to have that set of eyes. So it's a combination of understanding the perimeter of your platform and the aspects of it and what portions are in use and which portions need to be end of lifed, and then understanding the age of the various components in that system and setting aside time, which takes quite a bit of work. There's an endless amount of features and bells and whistles that your product team will ask you to build, but you have to push back and make some time to keep the platform modern and updated for a large number of reasons. And so that has greatly helped Applause move forward with our technology and architecture and meet our customer needs and still be agile, and also helps with recruiting because you're not working on an old system, but it's modern. It's got all the latest technologies in it, not just for the sake of technology, but also for longevity for our platform. So I'm super passionate about that, passionate on microservices. I'm a big believer in that. And then anywhere you can automate anything about the work you do, it allows you to focus more on other things. So, machines can help use them whenever possible.
Yeah. One thing that I think is interesting, like, we've talked about kind of some of these design principles that you have for the engineering team. And, when it relates to controlling open source consumption or looking at open source consumption, I imagine these principles can really impact how you collaborate with other business partners and design processes. So do you think you can give an overview of, how open source consumption is managed today at Applause, and, what a developer has to go through to use a new piece of open source software?
Yeah, it's pretty simple. We have some guiding principles around the sorts of licenses. I think we'll cover it coming up, but we have some guiding principles around the licenses that we are allow within the system. The developers, have that information. If they make a mistake, we have a safety net. We'll talk about that with FOSSA. But and that guidance has been given by our general counsel. So they've looked at the licenses and have decided for the business which ones are allowed and which ones are not allowed. So, but generally, the developers have the basic guidance. They most of the time select the correct packages. If they don't, it's caught on the first build in our build system. So caught long before they ever see the light of day. So we can correct that and undo it. But their developers are free to choose packages. So it's important we're picking packages that are, they meet whatever the requirements are for what we're trying to build. It's better if we don't build things ourselves, if we can find packages that meet our needs, because there's frankly more eyes on open source. There's more people involved. There's more people contributing to it. It's people we don't have to pay. And then we can, obviously contribute back to that as well if we find bugs or make additions or things like that. But we look for packages that are maintained, that are active, that have come from good pedigree, I guess you call it. Developers that have a good reputation, or sources that have good backing. and that they're responsive on updating for security issues or whatever. So so we're looking for things that are active, meet our license compliance needs, and so that we're expecting our developers to do some of that research. Look for the active packages, look that it meets your needs. Often that with so many options these days in open source, it's amazing. You're looking for one package to do one thing instead of writing it yourself. You might have a dozen options there, and so there is some manual work you have to do in picking the right package. It usually doesn't take that long, but that you do have to be careful around compliance and staying up to date on the security side of things.
Yeah, this idea of being biased towards using open source, I think, is super important. I think generally, open source has risks and needs to be managed, but I would say in the wholesale, like higher quality, if it's an active project, than what could be built internally, often more secure than what could be built internally. Even though open source vulnerabilities are a hot topic this year, and I think this bias of going to open source first is a really important bias. Something that stood out to me that may be relevant to a lot of people on this call. Sometimes we see this sort of more contentious relationship between the engineering team that's focused on moving and shipping quickly, and then the lines of business that are focused on keeping the company safe and enforcing policies that govern engineering behavior. And I guess, when I've looked at your program, it's felt like you've always had a really collaborative relationship with your GC, and you have a really aligned way of rolling out this program. I guess, how did you build that relationship? What, were maybe some of the tailwinds in your company that helped you get alignment between the business units and
engineering? Yeah, that's a great question. So one thing that helps a lot is the InfoSec team reports to me. A good portion of it does. So I have direct insight into the challenges and needs and things that team needs, and then it's my job to help them accomplish their mission in terms of protecting the business and being compliant with all of our customer requests. And and we're serving the largest brands in the world, so they've got lots of requests. And then the development team that has conflicting requirements, not necessarily conflicting, but competing requirements around time and resources for features and capabilities in the platform. So I broker that, and I work that, and I make it collaborative within my team. And then outside of my team, we have an excellent general counsel, and she has worked with many companies that have done open source in the past. So she comes from a background of experience and knows the value and knows the leverage that business gets out of open source. Without open source, applause wouldn't be where it is today. There's no way we could have built it all ourselves for anywhere close to the amount of investment we've been making in R&D over the years. And so I think having a business partner that understands the value that open source brings back, and that cost savings can be put back into the business in more teams and more sales, or wherever you want to put it. And so having business partners that understand the bigger picture is important. And we have an executive team that's great at seeing that bigger picture just from the experience that we have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I noticed that on one of your points, there's a focus on also contributing and participating in open source as well, beyond just managing its consumption utilization internally. Any reasons on why that's a focus for your team, or why you encourage people to contribute to open source projects and get involved in the community?
Yeah. So first of all, don't be a parasite. And life is always a good thing. If you're just consuming and taking, then you're a parasite in some way. So generally, my philosophy is don't do that. And also, if you're not giving back, if you're not contributing to open source, and everyone had that same philosophy, we wouldn't have any open source. So to me, it's kind of common sense. If you're using open source, find a way to give back. So we have at Applause, we have our own open source repository for things that we've built. May or may not be useful to others, but at least where we can, we make those public. And for each new repository we create, we go through a process with legal to make sure that there's no concerns or they consider it proprietary or what have you. And then as we're using open source packages, if we find generally not vulnerabilities, because that's not where we're focused most of the time, but if we're finding deficiencies, bugs, or what have you, we'll issue a pull request directly to the open source community. And some of my teams are closer to the open source components, and do that a lot. And some of the teams are a little more separated from that and less likely to do it. But generally, I encourage all the teams to, if you find a bug in open source, don't just live with it and don't just throw out the whole package if it meets our other requirements. Fix it if it's within reason and within the time frame you can. And so and I think that philosophy, I even had that philosophy when I was at much smaller startup type companies, because it's the right philosophy. And you are moving fast, you don't always have time, but rebuilding that whole piece of functionality from open source is even more costly. So put the time in, invest in something that's almost there, and that makes sense. And that helps the whole community. It helps everybody. And I do think open source is about giving back to developers and other companies that are trying to build products using open source. And a lot of the conversation we're having now is about how to make development processes more efficient and share those comments. So yes, we're making proprietary products in different areas and using open source, but we're able to share open source components. We're able to share development methodologies, and sometimes compete with each other, sometimes work with each other. But there are certainly areas where we can share and help different companies and partner with other people to move things forward.
Yeah, and we found often this philosophy of open source utilization, openness to open source contribution is really strategic for just establishing a strong culture to recruit into. I think the best developers in the world love working on open source, build reputation that way, interact with the community. They like contributing to the broader good. And also it's just a great way to get technically involved with some of the best communities out there too. And so to have a great culture to recruit into that'll attract the best talent. We find a lot of companies lean into this open source contribution mindset along with the consumption mindset.
There's some incredibly brilliant people that are working on these open source projects, and a lot of times they have a day job working on commercial software as well. But they're sometimes they're full time on open source, sometimes they're just contributing in spare time. But there are brilliant minds contributing to open source, and it would be a shame to not use what they're contributing.
Yeah. So I'm hearing a lot of tidbits of just best practices and philosophies here, and I'd like to take a second just to summarize this for the audience and merge it with a couple of observations around our customers on best practices and general principles to open source management. So I think the first big one is management of open source software today is just really business critical. Across all of our customers, over 80-90% of the code we see getting shipped to their end customers or ourselves too, maybe coming from some kind of third party. But as software developers or folks responsible for commercial software, we're accountable for licensing, security, and quality implications of all that code. And so businesses need to work on in conjunction across engineering, legal, and security teams to really understand the rules for using open source and enforce them. And I think the second big takeaway is that any approach today really needs to start with automation. The scale and speed of software development is large. It's really, really fast. And many of our customers are now managing these open source inventories of tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of unique components that they're incorporating, they're shipping, and that list can be constantly changing on a day-by-day or weekly basis. And so the kind of maybe third big takeaway that ties it all together is that for any process to be really successful, it has to be integrated into the developer workflow. It has to empower developers to move really fast. And so, developer experience is very important. The design and choice of tooling associated with the developer experience is super important. And so these are the kind of critical observations that we're seeing across our customers and general principles that I'd usually like to guide with. And I guess, Rob, I'm, I'd love to kind of hand it to you and, maybe you can give us a bit of background on the before and after of your open source management program. And we can maybe start with like what your initial pain points were and just where your organization was in the beginning.
Yeah, so again, I've been doing software engineering for a very long time. Back in the days before anyone really used open source, we built all of our own components from ground up, and that was a very painful world, having to build everything from zero. It's reinventing the wheel. So open source it was magic when it really came along and became adopted. But then rapidly ran into the challenges around licensing and compliance and all that sort of stuff. And so it turned into, spreadsheets of listing all the packages that you were using, and then what license they had, and then approval or not approval, and tracking those in spreadsheet programs, and spreadsheets. And then, getting the developers to remember to add to that spreadsheet and open it was disruptive to them, and they would forget, and then you'd have a compliance problem. Wikis came along, and we started putting them on wikis, which made it a little more accessible because shared Google Sheets weren't around at that time. So then you got a wiki, and you could start putting it on a wiki, but it's still a very manual process. And then the documentation to publish the required notices of use of open source. We had a documentation engineer that was writing that documentation and publishing a PDF that we attached to our corporate website. And that was a lot of work and it was a very manual process and error prone. And we had to go and double check that the licenses and the platform matched the licenses. And there was, it was always risky because there was no 100% surety that a machine had scanned it. It was always human eyes, human checking, and very time consuming and super painful. And so, for years we did that at different companies before Applause. When I joined Applause, I had inherited a system that was very similar to that, and I started asking the question. It was 2017 or something at the time, and I said there has to be a better way, and I started looking, and so. A lot of the tools that were out there that I ran into initially were just sort of lipstick on the old pig of wikis and spreadsheets, and they just kind of were an application that wrapped much of what we were doing, but still required all the manual work. And then ran into FOSSA, and you guys had it automated. You guys were scanning the software, you were picking up the licenses, you were automatically flagging, you were letting us set our what licenses we liked and what licenses we didn't like, the compliance rules. So we got to set our own preferences. You integrated with our workflows for bug tracking systems, so we could directly export compliance issues into our Jira system for engineers to work on. And later on, you added vulnerability management, which we'll talk about. But it was it was just a breath of fresh air in terms of a process. We threw out the old system. It didn't have to import anything because the whole new system was automated. So we could just literally delete what we had, connect it up, which was super easy, by the way. And then, just started working from day one. And so that was, definitely a breath of fresh air. I wish it was there many years beforehand, but it certainly allows us to know we're in full compliance, and to know that there are machines doing work where humans were, including myself, we're flawed in doing it the manual way, and it gives us a great deal of comfort on the legal side. And also it generates all the documentation that we need to stay in compliance with all those licenses, and we're able to answer questions from our customers on our use of open source and things like that. And so that's kind of a summary of how it's helped us go from the dark ages to the modern age.
Yeah, that's an awesome story. It's one that we love hearing from customers, and love being able to help with. And I think something really valuable for the audience is a journey to get there. And often when you're implementing a program like this, there's a lot of these smaller decisions that go into rolling a program like this out, or implementing one. And there some companies where this one you have control over parts of the information security team, and other companies there may not be. So maybe one area we could start with is just talking a bit about what your selection process looked like, and kind of what your initial design of the principles of what you're hoping to accomplish look like too. And I'm curious, like what were the sort of core principles that you were looking for in a solution? What led you to designing principles that look like that? Have you had kind of scar tissue in the past, or negative experiences with other tools that led you to looking for a certain kind of solution of a certain shape?
So I think one way of looking at it is, like, if you are embracing open source, you have package explosion. That's sort of the nature of embracing open source. If you are moving towards microservices, which bring all sorts of good things with them, you have a explosion of repositories and code across languages and technologies. Those multiply together and that to make a very large problem that's unmanageable from a manual perspective. So it was increasingly obvious, in our future architecture that we were working towards at the time, this is going back to 2017 now, that we were not going to be able to keep up. We were already struggling with license and compliance, but it was very clear that we were not going to be able to do the job. We needed something that was 100% automated. Yes, we need to look at the exceptions, but for the regular case, everything's good, the happy path, we needed that to be automated so we could focus just on the exceptions and dealing with those. And so a heavy amount of automation was important. And really, to get agreement that we needed to do something different, it was really stating, explaining the process sort of, and I did in a mini version in the last slide of, here's what we're doing today, and here's why this doesn't work logically. Like, here's why it won't scale, and here's how it's flawed. And what if there's a system that was fully automated? What was if there was a system that was able to scan and pick up the licenses? What if we could set our own license policies and have the system tell us if we're in compliance or not? And explaining that to a business that is again experienced leaders that have that are open-minded and can reason with logic. It was a very easy discussion, because it was just it's a rational thing to do. Is yes, we need automation. Yes, we need something being more compliance. Yes, there's a cost to it, because spreadsheets and wikis are free, and buying software to do this is expensive. But the cost of a lawsuit far outstrips anything in this area. So so it's easy to justify if you look at it from an insurance type angle of protecting your assets and your core. So it's not just about being good to the open source people and complying with them, but it's also about protecting your business from potential challenges or risks. And so that allowed us to justify the cost, which again was not significant against potential for legal issues.
Yeah. And so what did the selection process look like? How did you find and evaluate FOSSA and other tools? Did anybody else have to get internally involved, or were any?
Yeah, good question. So we looked at a number of different vendors. Again, it's been a few. I think we've been with you guys for 4 years now, so I don't remember all the names. But again, like some of those vendors were just really wrapping the process in an application that really was a dedicated version, not a wiki, not a spreadsheet, but really just an application that essentially did the same things. You had to put all the data in, you could track it, it did nice reporting, but none of it was automated. Some of them had partial automation, and so we looked for things that were easy to deploy, connected to our system. So we're on GitHub, so that's where all of our repos are. Scale was important to us because we have hundreds of repos, dozens of microservices. So we were very interested in scale. Language support was important, making sure that there wasn't going to be an issue there. Direct integration into our bug tracking system was important. And then, of course, we had to go through our InfoSec team requires a whole vendor review process, which gets extra inspection if you're plugging into the InfoSec process. So you guys had a lot of inspection from us as we went through that to make sure that as a vendor, you were in compliance with the things that our customers ask us to be in compliance with, because that's the new world. And so there's the whole number of factors that go into that. The thing that most impressed me about FOSSA at the time was how fast you were moving, how open you were, and how much of what we needed was there from day one. And so, over time, that's only gotten better. So, we have a lot more value today than we had when we started with you, and the team continues to move fast and give us, great service and response. And it's been, years at this point with FOSSA.
It's the startup way,
Yeah.
That's how we do it.
And, it is the startup way, but you guys don't behave like a startup, which is awesome, because we need, we're building enterprise software for the largest businesses in the world. We can't take any risk, and you guys are helping us avoid it instead of, a lot of startups add risk to your business. You guys are taking it away. So that's awesome.
Yeah. Well, thank you for those comments, and maybe we could jump into some key details about how you've implemented your program. And, I know there's two sides to it now. One side is the compliance side of the house. The other side is the, vulnerability management part of the house. And so you've made a bunch of decisions and details about how your current program works. Maybe you can talk a bit through the key parts of your program and how it's implemented. And I'll have a couple of questions that I think may be interesting for the audience.
Yeah. So first, obviously, you have to start with what are the rules for the business? Like what license do you allow? What licenses do you not allow? The developers don't necessarily need to know all the details. Some of them will be interested, some of them won't. But generally, what are the rules? And then, ideally, those rules are in a programmatic system that enforces them, so that you don't have to think about it. But give the developers the guidance in as clear language and an obvious place as possible. So in our own wiki internally, we have a place that is for all legal matters that you can look on, the general rules, the basic rules. But we make sure those basic rules are enforced through automation everywhere possible. So there's some licenses we like, MIT, Apache 2, those ones. And then other ones we don't like, GPL, LGPL, and there's schools of thought on those. So I don't want to start a whole argument in that one. But again, like while the developers have those rules, we use a system for the compliance, so we're not reliant on humans to be perfect all the time, because as humans we're not. And then so again, modern enterprise development practices, everything we do is based on a ticket from our ticketing system. All development work we do is on a branch specific to that ticket. Every ticket, when it's completed by the developer, we do a pull request, or basically a merge request into the development branch. That has two sets of eyes, so a second developer has to review it. But before that second developer reviews it, it has to pass the tests that run during the pull request. Those tests are unit tests, functional tests, things like that, but also license compliance tests. We fail the pull request and don't allow even a second developer to look at it unless it has passed license compliance along with the other tests. So it needs to pass all the automation we can throw at it first before we waste another set of eyes taking a look at the pull request. And then the next set of eyes is to make sure we're in compliance with all the different manual things we have to check that we couldn't automate. And so that's on the license front. And I guess we'll talk about the security side of things, but basically it's automated on every pull requests. Every build runs license compliance. So very early in the process, before the developer merges anything, they need to be in compliance, and there's no way to bypass that system. There's no exception guarantee. There's no override. There's no way to do that. It is, you either are in compliance or you go find something else, some new way of doing it. And that will slow you down. So they're heavily encouraged to be in compliance.
So, Rob, how did you establish an initial license utilization policy? Where did you kind of first start making opinions and decisions? Has that policy changed at all over time?
It hasn't changed much. We have some very experienced open source contributors on my team that are know much more than I do about open source, and are super active in certain communities. Some not related to our business. So they're like many open source people. They work a day job, doing a great job with applause, and on the side they're contributing to things like cryptocurrency and others, and our main lead maintainers there. And so I knew sort of the licenses that had been not popular but approved in the past in past companies, and sat down with our GC and said, listen, these are the ones I think are meet our requirements, but you need to read them and decide which ones fit well. And so they added and took away and adjusted the list until we got to a list that we agree on. Over time, periodically we do review that, but generally it hasn't changed much over the years. And packages that have very restrictive licenses tend to not have a lot of great maintenance and adoption and support because they're hard to use, and they add too many restrictions for commercial use. So while they might be used in other open source solutions and in non-commercial solutions, the ones that are benefiting the commercial solutions are the ones with the least restrictive licenses, without without really removing the credits that the open source contributors are due. So, people should be credited, they should be acknowledged for their contributions, but, infecting or, adjust, uh, impacting the commercialism of your business is something you can't afford to do as a commercial business. So, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Well, Rob, how are you handling like maybe trickier escalations that may not be fully catchable with automation? Do you have expertise around the table? Are you relying on inside outside counsel? Or is it that generally there hasn't really been many surprises because you've implemented this so early in the development pipeline that developers are usually directed away from anything that has a suspect license?
Well, we get periodic, again, not pretty low volume thanks to FOSSA's automation. We get periodic compliance warnings that a license can't be found or is missing or something in a package, and so those are generally the exception. They're not the rule, and they're very low volume. Those ones our InfoSec team has to look at, and they look at that on a weekly basis if there are any that week, and they have to go and look at the system and figure out what's going on. Is there a missing license, in which case it falls under certain rules, or is there a license and it's just wasn't found for some reason. And the issue there is, and this has been sort of eye-opening over time, is that the license world is still messy. I mean, there are guidelines for how to put a license file in your repo and do that well, but not all repositories, not all active open source projects do that correctly, or there's small mistakes in the way they do that, which can break automation at times. Again, it's fairly rare, but it does happen. And those are most of the kinds of exceptions we get. Other exceptions are basically asking for reports by customers that are interested, that need to know where are you on your use of open source and things like that. But generally, our compliance manual involvement is really on licenses that just weren't detected, and we have to go find them and put them in the correct place. And again, that's a small volume of exceptions versus the large number of open source packages that we use on a daily basis.
Yeah, and are you doing any reporting or attributions today on licenses? Are you like, what are some of the reasons maybe you're asked to prepare a report on open source use or software bill of materials or something for an audit?
Yeah, I think some customers are concerned about risk to their business, and they want to kind of understand your philosophy on open source, your use of it, and the kinds of packages. Sometimes the requests are honestly people that don't really understand open source that well. Like they'll say, okay, give me a list of all the open source packages you're using, which can be 10,000, or it can be hundreds of thousands of packages. So it's an impractical request. So a lot of times, our InfoSec team will get on the phone with the customer and say, what is your real question? Because giving you a list of 10,000 packages or what have you is not very useful. What is it that you're concerned about? Let's talk through our open source philosophy, why we use it, what licenses we allow, which license we don't allow, what is the threat that you're worried about, and trying to understand that. And a lot of that is about bad actors checking in something into an open source repository that will do malicious things, and what those could do to your use of that package. And so then you end up talking about like what the open source community is like, and having many sets of eyes on an open and public package is a good thing. It's open inspection versus a private repo where you could have a bad actor inside your company and maybe less sets of eyes on it. And so to me, it's actually safer in many ways to use open source whenever possible. Again, with the right licenses and scanning and all that sort of stuff. And again, that's why you look for active repos with many contributors, because if someone is doing something bad, there's going to be lots of eyes on it.
Totally. Well, speaking of bad actors, maybe this is a good time to move on to vulnerability management. Yeah. And so you have, kind of a consolidated process for both of these use cases of managing license violations and vulnerabilities. And I'm curious, like, how does your process for vulnerability management differ than your license compliance process? Are there any changes between the two?
Yeah, so a little bit different here. And so one of the great experiences we had at FOSSA is we started with license compliance, and later on you guys added vulnerability management. And that was a surprise. And at the time we were doing something else, and it wasn't as good as what you offered. And so we shut down what we were doing elsewhere and moved our vulnerability management to FOSSA, and it's been great for us. But there's a difference in license compliance. It's about scanning the open source packages and finding the license and then comparing that to your policies. And that's a different, because you're really looking at third-party packages and code, but you don't have to know exactly how the system is built. You just have to know, okay, this package is in use, and what is the license, and does that meet or not meet the requirements? Whereas with vulnerability management, you really need to know how is it built, because sometimes during the build process, you use packages to build the system, but you don't deploy them. They're just packages that are in use for building, but not being deployed in the sort of as built format. And so with vulnerability compliance or management, you want to scan as you're building and deploying. So not just the tools you use in development environment when you're learning things or setting things up or automating your local environment, but the things that you'll actually deploy into production that will be used by customers. So it's important, and that was a process for us. So we had to make sure that our containers were being scanned as we were building them, not just a repo. And that gets you much less errors, much less noise in the system, and gives the tooling, whatever tooling you're using, hopefully it's FOSSA, a good view of exactly what you're doing with your software. So that was quite a bit of difference for us in getting to that point. And but again, it's tied into the same system, so the same pull requests, the same merge requests. This is just another hard stop if it violates the scanning process.
Yeah, we observe often a really huge difference between what's getting used in development and what's getting used in production.
Exactly.
We find that running these tools in the build process to go, can sometimes cull away 60-70% of potential alerts or false positives.
Yeah, it's a little more work to do the as-built scanning on our side. But once we made that effort to do that, it was more than worth it. So definitely best practice, scan what you're deploying, and again, that's much easier in the microservices world too.
How are you managing violations and vulnerabilities around open source components that you're finding? Is your attitude to go to inbox zero and clear everything out? Are you prioritizing critical only? Does your attitude change depending on the repo or project that you're looking at?
Yeah, it's a good question. So our InfoSec team looks at all the alerts that come in from the scanning, and they triage that. And so they're making the judgment calls on priority. They do know sort of relative importance of areas of the project and tickets. But again, like anything, anywhere that has like a critical vulnerability or a day zero vulnerability, if it's in the as-built deployed scanning, it's going to get a certain level of product priority. So we have SLAs around the different levels of vulnerabilities that can be found. And those SLAs are then triaged and exported again directly from the system into our Jira system. And those are so they're first reviewed by our InfoSec team. Next, they're reviewed by our product team, depending on the severity. If they're urgent, they're reviewed immediately and escalated immediately. If they're less urgent, they're prioritized in a weekly triage meeting that we have between product and engineering and InfoSec to get it to the proper place in our global backlog for teams to pick up. So there are lots of lesser security tickets in our backlog that float in various places, and they get organized in batches, and sometimes we have a special push to get through some of those. And the high priority ones are at the top of the backlog and are getting picked up as we're kicking off our sprints, or sometimes they're put out as hot fixes depending on what we're doing.
And I noticed some failures are blocking on your pull request or development process.
Yes.
What governs that? Is it the criticality of an issue? Is it the criticality of the production system, or?
Yeah, it's generally the criticality of the issue. So again, that can vary by repo, as you would expect. So there are certain repos that if we're seeing a criticality in a certain repo, we will block it and not even allow the pull request to go through. That's, again, usually the developers are developing locally and then creating that pull request. So if they're doing the right things, they will generally see some of those warnings beforehand, but maybe not all of them, because what they run, they can take shortcuts, they can try to go fast, they may not see everything. So I mean, that's the wonder of automation, is you catch everything.
Awesome. Rob, this is super exhaustive. Thanks so much for sharing your stories. We have about 5 minutes left on the webinar, and so I think this would be a great time to move on to Q&A. And we can wait for a couple questions of the audience, but maybe just to kick it off or tie it off. Any big surprises ever pop out of open source issues that have popped up that you've seen, that or war stories, or potentially if not, like any big surprises or things that have surprised you? One distilled piece of advice for the audience around open source management that you've learned through this journey?
So open source is exploding and going faster every year. Like it's the number of packages we're dealing with this year versus last year is probably at least double. Like, so more and more open source is getting used, and it's been kind of shocking to me to see how fast that's exploding. And so this problem is not going away. There are solutions out there, as we've been talking about today, and without automation, there's no way to get through this. There's lots of good things. I'd love to see more rankings about open source packages, so that we spend less time picking the most active, least vulnerable open source package. So lots of good ideas and future products, hopefully from FOSSA there. But inconsistencies in licensing, that's a pain. So there's still pain even with great automation around it. The explosion of packages, watching as not only the compliance with your packages and the activity on them. Packages sometimes don't age well. Sometimes you do have to move on because a package becomes inactive, and the open source community is all but abandoned it. So sometimes there's a reason to refactor your code and take it out, even if it's in compliance, and even if right now it may not have any vulnerabilities. They don't age well. So sometimes you have to look at the aging of that too, as well as the contributions. You can contribute back, but if you're the only company keeping the thing alive, it may not make sense. You want to be where the action is, and not just for fun, but because you get the leverage from the open source community.
Yeah, package health and maintenance has become an increasingly important topic, and it's been a use case that we've added into our security product under this add-on called Risk Intelligence. We're also working on the selection part of the process, and creating better selection tools. One of the interesting things is that we have a bunch of teams and users and companies across a variety of industries that have now been using FOSSA for many years, and we've collected a fair amount of behavioral data on which open source packages are becoming popular or getting deprecated, what specific versions are getting used. And often we find, really surprising, non-intuitive insights around why certain versions are more popular than others, or, things that are impossible to machine parse. Maybe there's a regression or a change in the API that's surprising, or something like that, no amount of stack analysis would be able to pick up, but are very clear in the behavioral trends and the behavioral data. So it'd be interesting to bring more of those insights to our customers, and hopefully we can help you more at Applause. And
I mean, where you guys sit is a super exciting and interesting area where you can add a lot of interesting value over time. I know it's always competition on resources and everything, but I'm looking forward. I mean, you guys have helped us in a couple areas already, so I'm excited to see what you guys bring in the future, and it'll only make us better.
Great. Well, Rob, thank you so much for spending this hour with me. Thanks for all
happy to do it.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Your contact information is there, so all the attendees can, come and spam you with questions if they're, so curious. This is my email above, and you can reach me too. And for everybody on the call and everybody watching this offline, thank you so much for joining and investing your time in this. And hopefully this was helpful. And Rob, I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Yeah, always a pleasure, Kevin. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you so much. Take care, everybody.
Bye.